And there was this idea that somehow Saudi and Russia were at loggerheads with each other with regards to cutting oil production. And in fact, it was quite the opposite. We should all recall the sort of famous high five between Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, and Putin, which raised a lot of eyebrows. But it decided, well, we're going to sell oil more cheaply to Asia. We're going to keep the prices flat for Europe, but America, we're going to raise the prices for you. It's those little details that tell you everything you need to know about how Saudi's repositioning itself in the world. And it's a kind of chicken and egg situation, because what was the cause of Saudi Arabia to do this? Or what started it first? But they are really so angry with regards to the fact of numerous attempts to overthrow King Salman and MBS.
Hello there, my friends. Chris Marcus here with you for Arcadia Economics. And fortunately, we are in luck today because I have a special treat for you in that my good friend London Paul of the Sirius Report is back on the line. And Paul, certainly no shortage of fascinating life and geopolitical events have occurred since the last time we talked, which I think was the end of February, right when the markets were starting to get pummeled. We've seen a roller coaster in gold and silver since then. So lots to talk about. We'll have a couple clips for folks today and throughout this week. But first of all, Paul, it's a pleasure to have you back on. And how are you today, my friend?
Yes, and likewise, a pleasure to be on. And I'm very well, Chris. How are you?
I'm doing great. And it's so much to dig into. The first one I'd like to touch on is the oil, because since we last talked, we saw the price of oil to go to negative $40, which I don't think most people knew was possible. But even taking it a step further back than that, because there's something, you're the only person I've heard comment on this, and I'm sure there's a lot of other people that will like to hear this as well. But I remember maybe a month, 2 months ago on a Friday, I get a Wall Street Journal alert about the Saudi government. I mean, it sounds like they were doing a rebroadcast of Julius Caesar where someone's getting thrown out of power. By all means, you know the names and faces far better than I could even imagine. But then the next day after that, we saw this meeting fall apart between Russia and Saudi Arabia. And it's as if all heck has broken loose since then. My intuition told me that whatever I was getting from the Wall Street Journal was not in reality what went down. And I wondered what the real story was behind that. So perhaps you could break that one down for us.
Yeah, I mean, we actually need to go back much further than this year and probably 2 years ago or so. But there's been a whole series of events that have conspired to reach the point where we have with regards to Saudi and Russia. And there was this idea that somehow Saudi and Russia were at loggerheads with each other with regards to cutting oil production. And in fact, it was quite the opposite. We should all recall the sort of famous, well, low five, but high five between Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, and Putin, which raised a lot of eyebrows. But if you go back in recent historical context, there's been a lot of events that have shaped where we are now, and an enormous amount of pressure was put on Saudi Arabia. Okay, there was the horrendous murder of Khashoggi, which caused huge amounts of diplomatic pressure and tensions. But back in sort of January 2019 or so, even then the European Commission decided to add Saudi Arabia to this EU draft list of countries that are deemed to pose a threat to the EU because of the country's attitude towards terrorism, financing, and money laundering. So Saudi Arabia joined this inauspicious list of countries, including Iran, Syria, Yemen, North Korea, and Afghanistan. So you get the kind of idea of there was being a huge amount of pressure brought to bear by the US to put this amount of pressure and using the EU Commission. So there was this two-pronged attack, also including the UN and the EU, where they started claiming there was allegations that Saudi Arabia might be testing or manufacturing ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads. And oh, by the way, this was all in conjunction with personal orders given by MBS. So you kind of get the picture that there was this enormous demonization going on. Now, I'm not saying I'm any fan of MBS, but we have to put this in context that, again, the usual intelligence reports from American sources, which are anything but intelligence reports, that there was these, rocket engine test stands spotted. Oh, by the way, it actually resembled a design that's used by China. So, maybe if Saudi Arabia moves into this test launch phase, the US could then look at actually implementing sanctions on Saudi Arabia as it had done with Iran. Now, this was all an attempt to rack up the pressure on the House of Saud and to further sort of demonize and look to remove MBS. And there has been numerous failed coup attempts to get rid of King Salman and MBS. And they've obviously all failed. But Washington was certainly having this concerted effort with the US, the EU, the US Congress, US intelligence agencies to really try and trigger the removal of MBS and King Salman. And what was this really all about? Because ultimately, Saudi Arabia being this dutiful servant for decades in utilizing the petrodollar, well, really it was because Saudi Arabia, as we've said previously, was rotating east, and to some degree, an increasing degree, of course, Saudi is now adopting the petro yuan. I know some people don't think it exists, but it does, and it is notionally backed by gold. They've been also, Saudis are embracing not just China, but Russia, Pakistan, even tentatively in private discussions with Iran about sort of finding ways to try and reach some sort of détente on some level at least. Of course, de-dollarizing and embracing the Belt and Road Initiative, which is obviously the arch nemesis of Washington. And unsurprisingly, and we've said this before, the US influence in the Gulf is declining. And Saudi wanted to seek its own autonomy over its national security, and whether people like it or don't like it, Russia and even China has far better military technology than the US. So it's making that transition easier. We've had the US threatening to remove military personnel and Patriot missiles. Well, Saudi's not bothered about the Patriot missiles because, let's face it, those missile defense systems didn't really help them when it came to the attack on Aramco. So Saudi has been looking for a couple of years or so to acquire S-400s, and that is still privately ongoing. So Saudi is looking at rotating east, but of course that presents risks. But Riyadh no longer really is seeing the US as a dependable partner in terms of security, decreasing confidence in US leadership, and of course the US hegemony and the US dollar are in decline. We've also seen substantial developments in relations between the Chinese and the Saudis. And also, of course, Russia joined OPEC in its OPEC Plus agreement, which effectively completely sidelined the US and the petrodollar. Well, that was obviously the long-term intention. So that's a sort of bit of background as to why we are where we are, and what obviously we'll now discuss in some detail with regards to what happened with the May WTI contract and why it went negative. But maybe I'll just stop there so you can obviously comment.
Yeah, actually, one question on what you just mentioned, the relationship between Saudi and China. I know you, in your podcast on the Sirius Report, which is SIRIUS report.com, also in the description link below, where folks, you can check that out. It's one of my favorite podcasts that I get in my feed. And Paul, in there, you had mentioned before about how in the Saudi or the Aramco prospectus, there's actually a spot where you can see and that they have begun sending oil directly to China, so somewhat circumventing the petrodollar arrangement. And maybe if you could just, you don't even necessarily have to dig too deeply into it, but maybe point out where people can verify that for themselves, because I think that's the kind of thing that you're great at, your research, you're great at pulling up, and it's good for people to go see it for themselves.
Yeah, it's essentially it's in the Aramco IPO report. It's this enormous report, and it's buried. I'll see if I can go back and dig out that data, and I'll send you the little excerpt of where it proves that's the case. But what's also worth mentioning is how Saudi ramped up oil exports to China, which late summer last year. They doubled exports in the space of a year. And in that time, its oil exports to the US dropped by nearly 2/3. So to put this in context, sort of around July last year, they exported, I think it was about 1.8 million barrels per day compared to the July of the previous year, where it was half of that amount, where exports in July of 2018 to the US were down 62% from July the previous year. And, we can't be fooled by assertions that the reason for this is because the US is becoming self-sufficient based on the whole shale oil industry debacle. But what it was very clear at that point is there was a big change in the Saudis' attitude towards trading oil with China and with the US. What's also worth noting is the Saudis own the giant Aramco own Motiva refinery in Texas. And therefore, Aramco is willing to increase or decrease its exports to the US based on its own needs. And in terms of China, Aramco is going to meet customer demand. If China rings up and says, we want to increase oil imports, they'll just do it on that basis. So it was a very seismic change with regards to the relationship between Saudi and China, and of course, the relationship between the US and Saudi.
Yeah, it's amazing what's happening and how the mainstream media, I try not to sit here, be the guy bashing the mainstream media, but I mean, it's stunning how these things are happening. We're not talking about one day anymore. So again, I appreciate you shedding some light on this. And I guess right before my question, you were about to dig into how we end up with negative $40 for a barrel of oil.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we saw something which was unprecedented. But what did it mean in reality? Well, the May WTI contract went negative, and I think it settled at minus $37.6. I mean, which kind of notionally doesn't make any sense, but it actually does. I mean, it's an unprecedented moves, and while numbers tell one story, there are a number of factors which underpins this, which I think are worthy of discussion. And I'll try and walk relatively slowly through this because I'm going to mention some figures, so I want to miss and have to listen 3 or 4 times. I mean, there was an open interest of 109 contracts outstanding when the May contract expired. Now, each contract is 1,000 barrels of oil. Therefore, if you multiply the 2 numbers together, that equates to 109 million barrels of oil. Now, that open interest dwarfs what we normally expect to see. So the next obvious question is, how does anyone take delivery of that oil, given storage facilities are rapidly filling up and maxed out probably within weeks, and some argue by the end of May? Of course, when it comes to the question of the June contract that's now open, what we're seeing now is largely irrelevant. What will be relevant is what the contract price is when it expires. But especially, of course, given that the open interest for June is apparently 5 times what it was for May, which means we're looking at delivery of potentially over 500 million barrels of oil in a market where, as we know, there's not going to be any sudden spike in demand, because, as we know, we're in a sort of pandemic situation where largely the global economy is shut down, so there isn't a great demand for oil, and then of course there's nowhere to store the oil, and producers are going to have to rein in production. And what we need to do is extrapolate this going forward so we can get a picture. And what we're seeing is a real world example. We've talked about the illusionary world, which is what essentially controls the markets, but this is the real world, and the US Treasury and Fed can do nothing about it. So what was the backdrop to the events leading to obviously this negative print in the May WTI contract. Well, we know that OPEC has planned cuts starting in May for about 9.5 million barrels, but these cuts, as I said on my own podcast, would be of no use, because the real cuts might arguably need to be 30 to 40 million barrels per day. That's around what was telling us, of course, by the end of trading on that day, as we said, a barrel was minus $37.6. So, and the truth is, obviously, the oil's current value is consumed by this chronic oversupply, which has engulfed the entire supply chain for the sector. What also didn't help, the May WTI contract was supported by huge financial flows by retail and, unsurprisingly, institutional investors by ETFs. One of the largest crude ETF, the US Oil Fund, which accumulates a fifth of all the outstanding contracts in the May futures contract. And it then rolled its position into the June contract. So without the fund, the contract was quite literally subject to the forces of physical supply and demand. And at that point, the price went negative, so there was literally no bids. So the retail traders sitting on long position, enormous sell-off accelerating ahead of the close of the contract. The biggest problem you therefore have is when the contract settles at minus 37.6, a large number of refineries and pipeline companies have therefore told producers they'd only take their oil off them if they were paid. So effectively, you're going to have to pay for the privilege of someone taking the oil. The problem you, of course, have is you've got to have somewhere where to store it. So, okay, problem in itself. So what we were seeing then is true, demand supply market, and not what I term the rigged futures market. So we've gone back effectively at that time to a point when the oil industry and government sought to create price stability through supply control, and not, of course, by Wall Street speculators, for want of a better word. Now, of course, the collapse in the May WTI contract was an absolute nightmare for the Trump administration, who was trying to say, well, look, we've got this great deal with OPEC Plus. It's going to stabilize the oil sector. It's going to be great for shale oil. Well, of course, even now, the June contract is only at around $20 or $24, $25 a barrel. Well, the shale sector can't manage on oil being $55 a barrel, never mind $25 a barrel negative oil prices. And then inexplicably, the GOP came up with this idea, well, let's put trade barriers to save the shale industry, meaning tariffs on foreign oil. I mean, that was going to be a suicide mission to do it, but unsurprisingly, Saudi and Russia knew this was coming. They negotiated a deal they knew would amount to nothing, but would drive yet another nail in the coffin lid of the US shale sector. And we've talked about why that is going to fail, and for all the reasons we've discussed previously. Yeah, so in essence, sorry, go on.
I mean, I was just saying, it sure does seem almost like a dead man walking at this point, and you wonder how longer until, I mean, similar with the metals, but just such a fragile situation. And you some days it's amazing they keep propping it up there and sending it out and getting away with it.
Well, yeah, and really what the problem is in terms of the futures contract, those are all obviously the contract at the end of the trading window have to take physical delivery. Yep. Now, of course, that's not normally a problem because you don't have huge overproduction, but now we've got little demand and nowhere to store the oil. So therefore, we had this situation. There was no liquidity in this, what's supposed to be a highly liquid market. I mean, who knows how many retail and institutional investors got burnt or wiped out. But that's another example where the real world consumes the illusion. In essence, this virus I've referred to as being an accelerant. I mean, in terms of destroying the illusion and reality coming to the fore. I mean, it's probably going to be replicated in June and beyond for the US shale oil sector. And unfortunately, the biggest losers is going to be the entire US oil sector supply chain and associated industry. What's it going to do? It's going to cause ballooning of the trade deficit. The Fed's going to end up like it has to buy everything, the entire US shale sector and all the defaults on the debts. And the US oil sector, therefore, now is in total meltdown. I mean, we can like to pretend to the contrary, but it's a reality. And this reduction that they put in place was never going to match this contraction of around a third of global oil. And so therefore the collapse in demand is so great, all the cuts were meaningless. The inventories are going to fill up very quickly because some countries among the G20 agreed to buy oil for the national reserves. Russia doesn't even have a lot of storage capacity, and the capacity in Europe is going to be full. So US production is going to fall in tandem with a drop in prices. And therefore there's just no way out. It's just the spiraling death of the shale oil sector. Even majors such as ExxonMobil and Chevron are going to have to cut spending and expect to produce less crude in the coming months. Shale oil companies, we know, are in financial big trouble. They can't drill new wells. There's no capital expenditure, production stalling. And of course, the ability to soak up all the dollars coming home, which was the whole purpose of the shale oil sector, is being impacted. I mean, because here's the truth, each barrel of shale is being produced at a loss. And that's something that's often overlooked. Why were they doing this? Well, largely and only to soak up all the dollars coming home. Of course, banks are going to have to take over these failed industries, and there's a lot of talk of them not nationalizing, but it's a kind of quasi-nationalization by the banks who are ultimately, of course, at the behest of the US Treasury, which has controlled the Fed for decades. There's a lot of this idea that the Treasury took over the Fed. Now, the Fed is just a convenient vehicle for the US Treasury, i.e. the Exchange Stabilization Fund. And what was the other big thing that came out of this OPEC Plus deal? I mean, yeah, they said they're going to cut production and then they'd adjust it from July to December of 2020. Well, Iran, Venezuela, and Libya were all exempt from production cuts. So the US lost because China and India are major consumers of Venezuelan and Iranian oil, which is very cheap, and has to be bought in non-dollar terms. Russia and China insisted on this being part of this deal with the US, which is largely been overlooked. The US is admitting it's going to have to massively curtail production of shale oil. And the implication of this is it's going to have enormous effects on the energy markets, on high yield. It's going to have enormous effect on collateralized loan obligations of banks, the trade and budget deficit. So there are enormous problems, and major US lenders, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, apparently are going to set up independent companies to own all these oil and gas assets. Well, frankly, why would they do this? Because they're largely all failing. And just to rub real salt into the wound for the United States from a Saudi perspective, when it announced its official crude pricing, which is the OSP for May, it decided, well, we're going to sell oil more cheaply to Asia. We're going to keep the prices flat for Europe, but America, we're going to raise the prices for you. It's those little details that tell you everything you need to know about how Saudi's repositioning itself in the world. And it's a kind of chicken and egg situation, because what was the cause of Saudi Arabia to do this? Or what started it first? But they are really so angry with regards to the fact of numerous attempts to overthrow King Salman and MBS. Now, I'm no fan of the House of Saud or anything like that, but we're talking about the context of the geopolitical significance and why, in essence, the Saudis and the Russians concocted a deal which was to attack the petrodollar and to drive a dagger through the heart of the US shale oil sector. Well, we've explained why Saudi wants to do that, but more importantly as well, we shouldn't rule out Russia. We know precisely why Russia wants to do this, because the US has tried to prevent Nord Stream 2. They've tried everything they can to threaten, coerce nations to not take part in it. They, of course, have been facing off against the Russians in Syria. There's, of course, everything that's gone on in Ukraine, which the US was behind to try and cripple Russia in 2014 and then sanction them into oblivion to try and destroy them economically. And of course, we shouldn't rule out the small matter of several failed attempts to assassinate Putin in recent years, which never really gets reported anywhere, unsurprisingly. So the Russians and the Saudis have enormous reasons to want to, for want of a better word, stick it to the Americans. So if you look at of how the Saudi crude OSP prices are reflecting, they give a discount to China, India, the Asian Pacific. They're going to barter oil for goods and gold, whilst the higher prices are going to be charged for the fiat payers, namely the United States. And in essence, that's why we are where we are now in terms of the implications of what's happened to the oil price. Going forward, we're not going to see some dramatic improvement in the price of crude, but the problem you have for the US is they can't manage these prices. Saudi can manage for a short period of time, although they're already starting to have problems themselves. The one nation can cope in all this is Russia for a considerable period of time because they obviously have net no debt. They have an enormous sort of wealth fund of well over $500 billion, so equivalent. So they're positioned to be able to cope with this, but it is another major dagger in the heart of the Western deep state cabal that, unfortunately, many people seem to think are plotting a one world government that was never going to exist. And just as a little side note on this, what people will probably find interesting is the desire for a one world government came about during World War II, when the Americans tried to persuade the British, the Russians, and they didn't actually engage with the Chinese at that point, but they thought they could be the seats of power to have a one world government. By the end of World War II, that dream was over because, ironically, the British and the Russians both told the Americans there is no way there's ever going to be a one world government. And that was the end of the one world government story. And yet we find, 75 years later, people still think it's a reality, and it most certainly isn't.
Yeah, which is sure why I appreciate all the research you do. And again, that you share this on the SiriusReport.com. Link is in the description below. And folks, if you think the US government and Wall Street has made a mess out of the oil market, well, just stay tuned, because fortunately also recorded an interview with London Paul about the colossal disaster they're creating in the gold and silver markets, which, at least to everything I can see, appears to be unfolding as we speak. Again, Paul in London, so close to the LBMA, and you're going to want to hear that. So stay tuned, because here it comes.